All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So today we are taking a look at the much anticipated High Evolutionary. This is the latest and greatest big bad joining Marvel Snap later on tonight. If you didn't already hear, big bad, 6k tokens, not going to be dropping. So you can purchase this on release without having to worry about if it is going to drop in value, because it's going to be staying in that 6k zone with Kang, Galactus, Thanos, and so on. So, High Evo. What does the High Evo do? High Evo is at the start of the game, unlock the potential of all your cards with no abilities. We can take a look at what all those cards do right here. So all the no text cards get abilities. High Evo focuses on two main themes: afflicting your opponent with negative power and getting a benefit for not spending all your energy every turn. So I'm not going to read through every single one of these, but it's kind of pretty evenly split between reducing power and getting a benefit for unspent energy. And I think it's going to be really exciting. A lot of people are pretty hyped about this card, myself included, and we have a ton of decks to go over. I believe we have like 20 different decks, courtesy of Safety Blade. Before we dive on into the decks, do want to mention the article. Highly recommend giving that a look, link in the description, from Safety Blade. He put a lot of work in getting these decks together, and if you just want to easily import them or find out a little bit more information about them, definitely check out the article, link in the description below. Before we dive on into all the different decks we have here for this card, let's talk about if it is worth your tokens. So, obviously, by being a big bad, you don't really have to worry about waiting for this card to rotate, as it's not going to rotate. So you're going to be getting your 6,000 tokens worth, and I think this is one a lot of players are going to be picking up, even aside from big bad status, is because it's going to enable a lot of different decks. This card reminds me of Thanos in a lot of ways, where it's not just one card, it's a package of cards. And this is kind of even more interesting because, unlike Thanos, where you're forced to put all the stones in your deck, here you can pick and choose. You can have both of the Afflict and the Energy theme. You could lean one way or the other. So a lot of flexibility in terms of how you can play this card, which I really like. And I think it's the kind of most out there card in terms of enabling a bunch of different new decks, rather than just kind of maybe enhancing a pre-existing deck like we see with a lot of other cards that have come out recently. So I think this is definitely one of the better cards to buy. If you're on the fence, though, there's no harm in waiting a day or two and seeing how the early results are going. If you're thinking about using your 6,000 tokens elsewhere, where you're still saving up, I don't think you're going to miss out a ton if you don't buy this immediately on release if you're on the fence. But if it's a card that interests you and you have the tokens for it, I think it makes sense to get it because it's not going to be dropping. So, cool card. I'd recommend it, and I'm excited to see all the different things play out when it releases later tonight. All right, so let's take a look at the decks here, starting out with our first one, the full package, as Safety calls it, and a little self-explanatory here. We put all our High Evo cards in the deck, pretty much. And then we have some additional supporting cards, Scorpion, Spider-Woman, both going to contribute to those negative afflictions. I like the debris choice quite a bit, because it helps guarantee that there's going to be stuff in the opponent's lane that we can hit with our negative afflictions. And then Nebula and Sunspot rounding it out here outside of the High Evo cards, as well as She-Hulk. So Sunspot, She-Hulk makes a ton of sense in these versions where you're going to be doing the not using all your energy every turn stuff, and then Nebula, just really good one drop, so makes sense. I think this version is actually going to be fairly strong. However, by leaning into it so heavily, obviously we are going to be a little bit weak to Luke Cage, who I have a feeling is going to be pretty popular tonight. So maybe keep an eye out for him. And if you're seeing a bunch of other High Evo decks, maybe he's worth finding a spot for in your own High Evolutionary deck. Another version we have here of the full package, same style of deck, we just make one card substitution, where taking out the Nebula in place of Enchantress, and this is probably to deal with the Luke Cages that I was just talking about. So if you're a little bit worried about all the Luke Cage stuff going around, and Enchantress just has a A pretty wide variety of targets that she hits right now. Definitely could be worth a tech inclusion to make sure that our game plan doesn't get disrupted by the ultimate counter card. If you're looking for something a little bit more budget friendly, especially if you're just entering into pool 3, this is probably a good option for you. The whole deck, aside from High Evolutionary, is not even a Series 3 card needed. It's all Series 2 and below. So that's one thing that's pretty cool about this card, is by using all these no-text cards, aside from Wasp, who probably you want to include if you have it, you can be fairly budget friendly with this deck and probably still have a very decent amount of success. So that's pretty cool to see, as a lot of the other big bads, except maybe Kang, have been pretty reliant on other powerful synergistic pool 3 cards. So the fact that you actually can make a quote-unquote budget high evo deck is pretty sweet. Next up, we have a list that is all in on reducing the opponent's power. We're running Luke Cage ourselves, not only to counter other high evos, but so we can include Hazmat in this deck. We have Zabu because we have a lot of 4-drops in this deck, Absorbing Man to copy some of our powerful affliction effects, or even just the Hazmat if we want. Debris again being useful here to guarantee we're going to have those afflict targets, as one of the weaknesses to this afflict style deck is if the opponent just doesn't play a whole lot of cards for us to be able to afflict. But I like this style of version. I'm very curious to see how the Hazmat Luke Cage stuff ends up doing, but I have a feeling it's probably going to be pretty decent, because I think a lot of people are going to be playing high evo, so just having the Luke Cage in your deck to shut off the opponent's ability to get a cheap abomination is probably going to be pretty good. And if there are a bunch of decks going wide, Hazmat will also be very nice. If you don't want to go as all in with the afflict theme with this style, you can still get away with running a lot of the afflict stuff, but putting a little bit of the mana reduction or not using all your energy theme in here. We don't really need a ton of cards that do that. Hulk is our big payoff for it. Shocker helps enable it, and then Sunspot is another payoff where we get a bit of benefit from not spending all our energy. So if you like the style of the Hazmat Luke Cage stuff, but you don't want to be all in on the afflict theme, this seems like a decent way to go. This next version is a bit of a junk lockdown style deck, so we are able to kind of clog up the opponent's board more effectively. We have things like Viper and Hood. Viper is also good with the Debris Rocks. Again, Debris Rocks always going to be nice for guaranteeing we have targets for these afflictions. Polaris, another really big one, where just being able to yoink a cheap thing, maybe one of our rocks, into a lane where they already have 3 cards, really good. Titania also helps with that because it can make it awkward. We can fill their lane with the Titania and then get it to flip back on the final turn to guarantee a lane. Obviously, Nebula going to be good in this kind of strategy as well, because she gets a big benefit from the opponent not being able to play cards in her lane, hopefully because it is full. Next up, we have Toxic Sera 2.0. So some of you might remember that Sera actually kind of adapted in a Luke Cage Hazmat package a while ago, and it kind of fell off in terms of popularity over time, but for a little while there, it was actually a pretty popular version of Sera, and this looks to bring that back with High Evolutionary. We don't actually go super all in with a lot of the high evo stuff because there's just a lot of other powerful stuff we can be doing, and again, running the Luke Cage Hazmat stuff, we're also aiming to counter some of the other high evo decks going around. Enchantress also kind of leans into that. Running Iron Lad for a chance of copying our powerful afflict stuff. If you don't have Lad, maybe you could consider putting Shang-Chi back as leaning a bit more on the tech heavy side, but I do like the Lad inclusion if you have access to him. And obviously Zabu going to be good when we have a critical mass of 4-drops here. Other than that, just cards that are generally good in Sera, like Lizard and Max, especially on the final turn. And Shocker can be pretty helpful in getting some of our powerful 4-drops or even our Sera out early. Next up, we move into Lockjaw territory, starting with a Thor Lockjaw build. I really like what Safety did with this one, and I think it kind of shows that you can get away with running a very, very small high Evo package in some of these decks. And that's probably the way you kind of want to do it. I don't think you really want to reinvent the wheel when it comes to these Thor Lockjaw decks. They are already kind of proven to be fairly consistent. This just takes the high Evo to give our Wasp a bit more value, and the Hulk, because there are quite a few times in the early game where we're going to just be floating our mana, so the Hulk will naturally be getting bigger as another big thing to pop out of Lockjaw, so kind of replacing the common Abomination there. And again, we have Lad because there's just so many effects we would really like to copy in this deck. I don't think you need Lad to play this deck. You could definitely replace him with another good 5-drop or 4-drop, but I do think he is a pretty cool inclusion, especially if he can copy something like the Hulk's ability or help guarantee us getting out our Thor hammer. High Evo himself is also a card we just don't mind tossing away into the Lockjaw because 4/4 is not that big, and looking at our deck, the odds of us pulling out something better are pretty high. Another Lockjaw deck that we can try out with the High Evolutionary is a Thanos Lockjaw. One of my favorite archetypes, really cool archetype, and one that I think High Evo fits in pretty well. This does put in a bit more in terms of the Afflict cards than the Thor version we just looked at. Also, Killmonger I think is really, really good right now. Running both Killmonger and Wave is going to be super duper helpful, not only dealing with the other high Evo players who are trying to spread the rocks around with debris if they're on those Hazmat versions, but Kitty Pryde is quickly becoming public enemy #1, putting out an absurd amount of power. So the fact that we're packing 2 different ways to deal with the Kitty bounce stuff, I think is really, really good for this style of deck. Some people might be a little confused why you're running the Killmonger in a deck with all the Thanos stones, but sometimes our lanes just get a bit too clogged and we need to clean them up with the Killmonger. We're really not leaning on the stones as much for power as we are for cycling their individual effects and just being able to toss them into the Lockjaw to hopefully pull out something bigger. We're running quite a few of the high Evo stuff here, so our Afflict cards, we have Wasp, Thing, Cyclops. Abomination gives us payoff while also giving us a big thing to pop out of the jaw, and Hulk, because there are going to be times where you really only have to float energy 1 turn for Hulk to be pretty good, a 6/14, and then anything after that, it's just gravy. It's just a bonus on top of it. So I'm excited a lot for the Thanos Lockjaw, and I can't wait to see how this archetype gets refined, but I think this is a good jumping off point to start with. Another direction you can go in with the Lockjaw Thanos stuff is an ongoing version. So this is one that's fallen out of popularity a bit, but I really like how Safety built this one. It's kind of like a zoo style deck where we're using our stones as like the tiny zoo creatures, and then a lot of the other stuff in the deck, we're buffing them up or putting out a ton of power so we can justify that Lockjaw inclusion for the high rolls. It's always funny to me how these Thanos decks look so lopsided because we don't see the stones taking up, another 6 slots in our deck. But I like how this one's built. Obviously, a very big focus on ongoing cards. The majority of the cards here are ongoing or they benefit from ongoing stuff. Iron Man, I think, going to be pretty good, though you will have to be a little careful with the opponents running Afflict stuff going around. But I like how this one's built. We have a lot of big stuff to pop out of the jaw. Hulk, Thanos, Spectrum's good, Dino's good. We have things that support a go wide strategy with Khazar and Blue Marvel. Ant-Man, obviously a pretty premier 1-drop as well, since we're going to pretty easily fill the board. And this really, again, just goes to show you don't need a ton of cards with the High Evolutionary for it to still be a worthwhile inclusion. Like here, we just have Wasp for the Lockjaw, Abomination kind of as a high roll to pop out, or just getting that benefit from Wasp. Because sometimes we will play Wasp multiple times, and that might just be enough to get a cheap Abomination. And then again, Hulk, you really do only need 1 turn for the card to actually be very worth not only pulling out of the Lockjaw, but just playing on the final turn. Next up, we have a bit more lane control style stuff. So this is leaning into the Professor X Storm kind of thing, running a bit more of the high Evo cards in this style of shell, as well as armor to protect some of them, namely our Nebula, who's going to naturally be very, very good in things like the Storm lane. Professor X also helps protect her, which is convenient. Jeff is really good in these style of decks if you have him, because he helps you out where you might mess up and the opponent might be winning the Storm lane. So being able to flip it at the end with Jeff, or especially the Professor X lane, that can be the difference maker sometimes. Claw is a pretty cute one here, where you can definitely catch people off guard with Claw. Maybe someone does the Jeff math. They figure they can beat the X lane, even if you play Jeff, but then you surprise him with the Claw. So I like that because most people definitely do not play around Claw. Other than that, definitely leaning heavily on the Affliction cards, but since this is a deck that naturally sometimes floats a mana, Hulk not bad as a top end. And then another version you can consider of that same deck here is pretty much same deck, but we end up running Gamora instead of the Abomination, as she just goes a little bit taller and obviously has good synergy with the lane closure stuff, as we're kind of limiting where the opponent gets to play their cards, so it's easier to guess where Gamora needs to go to get that max power. Then we have a Sera Surfer style, so this is one that didn't even cross my mind, but I like what's going on here. We do have cards that synergize with the Afflict theme, working well in this style, mainly Debris. Cyclops obviously was kind of considered in the old Patriot versions of Surfer, so now that he has actually good text, definitely a worthwhile inclusion. Polaris still really good, especially against all the Nebula going around and the other cheap stuff. Shocker I think is going to be particularly powerful when it hits our Sera. Or even just hitting one of our 3-drops, because the times we miss on Sera, it might enable us to be able to go 3-drop into 3-drop on turn 5 if one of them is reduced. And given that most of our deck is 3-drops, the odds of that happening should be pretty likely. Wolfsbane makes sense because we're going to be filling up these lanes quite a bit. So we aren't really going over the top in terms of like all the high Evo cards. We're just kind of using them as good cards in a deck that's trying to just do Surfer things, and I think that's probably fine. I would kind of want to maybe get a Storm in here because I think Storm really benefits the Surfer archetype, but it's kind of tricky to be able to fit everything you want when you're trying to include the high Evo package, because even when you're only using a few cards, like here we're only using high Evo and 3 other cards, that's still a pretty big portion of your whole 12 card deck. But I like this version. I think it's going to be pretty interesting to see if the high Evo ends up making the cut in this Sera Surfer style deck. Next up, for my RNG high rollers, we have some Hela decks. So Hela obviously doesn't have a whole ton of direct synergy with high Evo, but we kind of want that Hulk. That Hulk's pretty nice, and the Hela deck does often not spend all its mana in the early game, so we can justify the Sunspot inclusion there, lean on that pretty heavily for our early mana that we're just not using, and also pumping that Hulk for later on. Morbius, another one where we're going to be discarding quite a few cards, so another decent early game. And Invisible Woman keeps the opponent guessing a bit, doesn't totally reveal that we're going to be a Hela deck, also helps with not discarding Hela before we actually want to, which is convenient, though do be weary of Enchantresses. Those are still pretty popular, but neat idea, and definitely further goes to show that you can really just make the High Evolutionary a 2-card package in some builds, and it might still be worth it. And then another thing you could consider is a small ramp package in here, so that way we can actually play more of these cards if we aren't going the Hela route. Sandman really good right now at shutting down the opponents who are trying to play a whole lot of cards, and Electro leans very heavily into this theme where we're trying to float excess energy to pump up this Hulk for the end of the game, and She-Hulk obviously good with that too. So pretty neat version, and I'm definitely going to be trying this one out when he launches later tonight. Next up, we have the She-Hulk Hitmonkey Moon Girl deck. So this deck, not quite as popular as it used to be, but I think pretty underrated and pretty strong. And high Evo can do some cool things here. Doubling up on the Wasp is obviously convenient because not only is it giving us more cards to play on the final turn for boosting the Hitmonkey, but we are also reducing power to the opponent's cards. So the Wasp actually ends up being even better value, pumping our Monkey, pumping our Bishop. We have Cyclops to also help enable the reducing cost here for the Abomination, because Abomination essentially ends up being a second She-Hulk for us, where if we can get enough of these afflictions, we can hopefully double up and play a bunch of 9 power things on the final turn of the game. Titania, also a good one, because we will often be throwing priority, so it just ends up being a 1/5 or 2 1/5s, so we can double up on it. I definitely like this idea here. Shocker, also good, because it helps reduce the cost of stuff, and that can be especially helpful on some of the higher cost cards in this deck, the 3 cost, the 4 cost cards, so we can hopefully get them out of our hand so we get a better value out of our Moon Girl. Another direction you can take that deck is with a little bit of a bounce package, where we can bounce our Hood to get multiple demons. We can bounce our Hitmonkey so we can grow it a bit, bounce it back, play it for a ton on the final turn. We have Carnage to eat up the things we don't really care about, like Hood or Mysterio, and he might get some extra value from eating up some cards that were afflicted by opponents' other high Evo cards. And we can't mention a bounce style deck without thinking about Kitty Pryde, the premier bounce card that everyone got recently. So this version tries to take advantage of her a bit more, ends up justifying the Angela inclusion as she is very busted with Angela, ends up being really, really powerful, and we are still able to get away with doing the reduced cost Abomination for Moon Girl. Again, much lighter on the high Evo stuff, but I think you can get away with only using Wasp and Cyclops and Abomination for this build, as it's already doing very powerful things on its own. This just enables us to have more times where we're going to be able to essentially just cheat out, you know, the big She-Hulks on a final turn. Abomination is just another She-Hulk for this deck, which is exactly what it wants to be doing. And to close it out here, we're going to take a look at 2 versions of Shuri. So, mentioned in the Infinite Decks of the Week video the other day, maybe people moved away from Shuri too quickly. The deck actually still seems to be performing fairly well, even though it is not very popular anymore. And these high Evo cards can pretty naturally fit into a Shuri-style deck. Much like in the Moon Girl Monkey deck, Abomination ends up just acting as another chance at She-Hulk. And this deck really appreciates that. Because we are leaning very heavily on She-Hulk in this version, as we aren't running some of the other bigger things like Red Skull or even Vision. So we're leaning a bit more heavily on having a She-Hulk or Abomination that we can hopefully play for very little cost and then copy with the Taskmaster post Shuri, while also afflicting the opponent's stuff with negative afflictions. So that helps with the power, armor obviously for protection, Jeff just because he's Jeff, good 2-drop. We are doing a little bit with the floating theme here. However, I think this deck generally does kind of want to play on curve. It's mainly just having the Sunspot for reducing the She-Hulk, makes sense, and Wasp just pretty good at 0 power and getting us a bit more power onto the board on the final turn. And then we just have another version of it here, almost the exact same deck. We just end up replacing Jeff for Lizard, so a little bit more budget friendly. You could probably also consider Luke Cage if you're worried about the opponents doing all the high Evo stuff to you, but since we go very tall with this Shuri deck, I don't think we're going to be overly concerned about a few minus power things, but at the least, it is going to basically stop the opponent from being able to cheat out their Abomination, so could be worth a consideration. And there we have it, a ridiculous amount of decks for high Evo. So much stuff to try. I can't wait to see what people do with this card when he drops later tonight. I'm really excited for trying it out. Again, if you want to check out more information about some of these decks or just grab the code to import them, definitely suggest checking out the article from Safety Blade, link in the description. But yeah, let me know what you think about this card in the comments. Are you planning on picking it up? What are you excited to be brewing with it? Let me know in the comments below. But that is going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe, and stay tuned here on Marvel Snap Zone for all your Marvel Snap content. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.